They called her just a nurse. Katie Rodriguez kept her eyes fixed on the vital signs monitor, watching the numbers climb with the kind of steady attention most people reserved for things that mattered. Oxygen saturation at 94%. Heart rate holding at 78. Blood pressure 120/80, textbook normal for a patient who'd been intubated for 47 hours. She didn't look up when Dr. Mercer walked past her station at 2 in the morning, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum like a metronome counting down to something neither of them expected yet. They didn't know what she was charting under that name badge. They didn't know that the slight tremor in her hands, the one she let them see, was calculation, not fear. The one thing nobody knew was that Captain Katie Rodriguez had walked into Seattle General 6 months ago on a federal warrant, and every perfectly executed vital sign entry was part of something much larger than keeping one man alive in the ICU. The night shift stretched before her like it always did. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the nurse's station, a sound that had become as familiar to her as the whine of a medevac helicopter. She moved through the corridors at 2:10 in the morning with the kind of invisibility that came from being underestimated consistently. The other nurses saw a competent but unremarkable RN with kind eyes and steady hands. What they didn't see was the Bronze Star citation folded inside her locker, pressed against the flag she'd brought back from Bagram, a flag that had draped the shoulders of Luis Marquez, her field medic, before they put him in the ground. She carried his memory like everyone carried their phones now, constantly, without thinking about the weight of it. Bed 7 held the new transfer. The chart read Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, admitted at 1840 hours from a classified operation, condition listed as critical but stable. Katie read those words and her jaw tightened by exactly the fraction of an inch that nobody would notice. Marcus Chen was the combat medic who'd taken her position when Army intelligence pulled her for this assignment. Marcus Chen had operated in the same dust and blood and gunfire that she had. And now he was lying sedated in her hospital with a central line running into his left subclavian, his breathing guided by a ventilator, and she was supposed to pretend she'd never seen him before. She approached his bedside at 2:17 a.m., when the corridor was empty except for the fluorescent hum and the sound of someone's call light ringing 3 rooms down. The antiseptic smell mixed with something metallic underneath, copper maybe, or the ozone tank that came from electrical equipment running hot. Marcus's sedation level sat at a 2 on the Richmond scale, deep enough that he wouldn't wake, wouldn't know his old commander was standing over him charting his progress like she was just another nurse doing paperwork. But her hands knew better. Her hands knew the difference between routine vitals and the kind of assessment that came from having kept men alive in places where the only anesthesia was adrenaline and the nearest surgeon was 40 kilometers away. The limp in her left leg became more pronounced as the shift wore on. The IED blast had scarred her on the left side, a piece of shrapnel that had taken a divot out of her femur and never quite let her walk straight again. The other nurses assumed it came from a car accident. She'd let them assume. The story was easier than the truth, and easier was safer, and safety was the only way she could stay embedded long enough to gather the evidence. Dr. Mercer had been running a medical supply kickback scheme for 8 years. 8 years of false invoices, inflated contracts, and somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.3 million flowing from hospital accounts to offshore entities he controlled. She had for email chains and a partial bank ledger. She needed the phone records and the procurement officer's testimony. She needed 3 more months, maybe 4. She needed Marcus Chen to stay alive. The monitor above his bed displayed the clean, regular rhythm of someone whose body was doing exactly what the medications told it to do. The ventilator delivered 40% oxygen at 12 breaths per minute, the kind of steady support that would keep his lungs inflated while whatever internal injuries he'd sustained, the chart was classified, no details beyond what she could see herself, healed on their own timeline. She checked the 4 sites, the catheter placement, the dressing around the central line. All of it perfect. All of it exactly what it should be. All of it the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The doors to the ICU hissed open at 2:33 a.m. Dr. Mercer appeared in the corridor with the kind of early morning energy that came from either not sleeping or never needing to. He was reviewing files on an iPad, his glasses perched on his nose, his expression already arranged into the particular contempt he reserved for nurses who worked night shift. Katie continued charting without looking up. She'd learned 6 months ago that acknowledgement was an invitation. Invisibility was armor. "How long has Chen been in bed?" 7, Mercer asked, not looking at her, the words phrased as a statement rather than a question. 47 hours, Katie said. She kept her voice soft, deferential, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never made a decision more significant than choosing between two full gauges. Stable through the night. No complications. Mercer glanced at the monitor without approaching the bedside. He didn't examine the patient. Didn't check the drip rates or the catheter placement. Didn't do any of the things that would have taken 30 seconds and might have revealed something useful. Instead, he nodded and turned back toward the corridor. "Keep him sedated. I'll be back for morning rounds." Katie watched him disappear through the doors. She returned to her charting. The numbers in front of her, heart rate, oxygen saturation, blood pressure, urine output, Glasgow Coma Scale score, they told a story that she could read like a combat situation map. Marcus was alive because his body was young and trained and genetically configured for survival. But he was also alive because someone at a field hospital in Loga province had done exactly what the protocol said they shouldn't do. Someone had taken blood from a supply meant for a surgical team and pushed it into his veins without paperwork. Someone had made a choice that violated about 17 different regulations and possibly saved his life. At 2:51 a.m., the monitor above Marcus's bed changed its song. The beeping accelerated. Not dramatically. Not in the way that would trigger alarm bells in the nurse's station. Just a subtle shift in cadence that Katie's muscle memory recognized as early warning. She was moving before her conscious mind had finished identifying the problem. She checked the oxygen saturation first. No, that was holding. Blood pressure, climbing. Heart rate, 104, and rising like someone had reached inside his chest and turned up the volume. She looked at the central line, checking for signs of infiltration or kinking. The 4 sites were clean. The medication infusions were running at their prescribed rates. Then she saw it. The ventilator's pressure alarm was starting to climb. The volume being delivered was meeting resistance, which meant something inside Marcus's lungs was changing. Filling with fluid, maybe. Or air in the wrong place. Or the kind of pressure change that came when the pneumothorax, the partial collapse she'd noted from his initial exam, decided to shift from a 5% to something more serious. She checked his breath sounds. Left side clear. Right side diminished. Not absent, not yet, but moving in that direction. The kind of direction that ended with a patient requiring immediate intervention. Katie reached the call light and then didn't press it. Instead, she approached the bedside and did what they'd trained her to do in this exact scenario. She examined him methodically. She assessed him the way someone would who understood that every second mattered and panic was a luxury for people who didn't have training. His right side was showing decreased breath sounds. His heart rate was climbing. His oxygen saturation had started to trend downward, 92% now, falling from where it had been just moments before. Tension pneumothorax. Building pressure in the right chest cavity, compressing the lung, pushing on the heart, doing exactly what pneumothorax did when nobody stopped it. The on-call resident was in the physician's lounge. She knew this because she'd heard him on the call bell 3 times that evening, each time slower to respond than the last, each time sounding more tired. By the time he arrived, assuming she called him, Marcus would have 5 more minutes for the pressure to build. 5 more minutes for his oxygen saturation to drop below 85%. 5 more minutes for his body to start shutting down. Katie stood at the bedside of a man she wasn't supposed to recognize and made a decision that violated protocol in exactly the way that decisions made under pressure always violated protocol. She moved like muscle memory was the only voice in her head. Like her hands had done this before in places where there wasn't time to wait for someone else's decision. Her own supplies were in the crash cart, organized the way she'd organized them 6 months ago when she arrived at Seattle General. She pulled the 14-gauge angiocath needle and cleansed the skin at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location for emergency decompression. The needle went in with the kind of smooth precision that came from having done this intense under fire. The hiss of air escaping from the pneumothorax was like relief itself being released. The monitor above Marcus's bed changed its song again. The heart rate began to slow. The oxygen saturation steadied and then climbed, 88%, 92%, 95%. The resistance on the ventilator eased. His chest rose and fell with less strain. Katie secured a catheter with tape and stepped back. The needle decompression had worked. The pressure had released. Marcus Chen was still alive, and nobody would ever know that the woman charting his vitals at 3 in the morning had just violated about 17 different protocols to keep it that way. She returned to the nurse's station and continued her paperwork. The monitor displayed normal rhythms. The numbers held steady. And somewhere inside the hospital, a federal investigation into Dr. Mercer's kickback scheme just became infinitely more complicated, because now Katie Rodriguez owed Marcus Chen his life, and you didn't repay that kind of debt by walking away. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her. She charted everything except the needle decompression, that one she would decide about later when she understood exactly what it meant that Marcus had crashed so soon after arrival. The clock read 3:04 a.m. Dr. Mercer would arrive for rounds in 4 hours and 46 minutes. Katie opened her assignment for the rest of the shift and waited for the next problem to solve. For hours and 46 minutes after Katie's hands had stilled Marcus Chen's bleeding, she stood in the amphitheater of Seattle General's grand rounds like a woman standing in the crosshairs of someone's scope. Dr. Mercer circled bed 7. 12 residents in white coats. For attending physicians arranged like silent judges. The morning light cut through the high windows in geometric slabs, and Katie could feel the weight of every eye that wasn't looking at her, which meant they all were. This, Mercer said, his voice projecting like a surgeon's teaching voice always did, smooth and cutting, is what happens when you skip fundamentals. Nurse Rodriguez here decided protocol was optional last night. Katie's hands hung at her sides. Perfectly still. Perfectly empty. Mercer gestured toward the bed where Marcus lay sleeping, his chest rising and falling on the oxygen Katie had saved him to breathe. During the night shift, Staff Sergeant Chen presented with a hypotensive crisis. His blood pressure was collapsing. His hemoglobin was tanking. And instead of calling the attending on call, instead of following the verification protocol that exists for a reason, Nurse Rodriguez took it upon herself to administer O negative from the rapid release. No second verification. No attending signature. No chain of command. One resident whispered something to the resident beside him. The whisper traveled like electricity through the group. Type O negative, Mercer continued, his eyes settling on Katie's face now, looking for something, a flinch, a flush, any crack in the facade. Straight from rapid release. What are we running here, a field hospital in Kandahar? He smiled at his own joke. 2 residents smiled back. The attending physicians did not. Katie's jaw tightened. Just once. A muscle moving beneath the skin like a trapped animal testing its cage. In a real medical facility, Mercer said, turning back to the residents, in a functioning hierarchy, we follow chains of command. We don't play cowboy medicine. We don't let nursing staff make critical decisions that belong to licensed physicians. We follow protocol. He paused, letting the silence settle over the room like a blanket pulled tight. Nurse Rodriguez, do you have anything you'd like to say? Katie's voice came out even. Level. Not apologetic. Just clear, understood, doctor. No, I'm sorry. No, you're right. Just acknowledgement. The kind of response that came from someone who had learned long ago that explaining yourself to people who had already decided gave them ammunition. The grand rounds continued. A different case. A different resident presenting. But the air in the amphitheater had changed. Mercer had drawn blood. Now the sharks smelled it. 3 hours later, Katie stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. Her fingers fed quarters into the slot with mechanical precision. Her eyes tracked the spiral mechanism that would release the granola bar, the small mechanical thing working exactly the way it was supposed to work because it had no thoughts, no doubts, no survival instinct screaming at it to protect itself. Mercer rounded the corner with 2 surgery residents trailing him like pilot fish behind a larger predator. "Rodriguez," he called out, his voice loud enough for the nursing staff moving through the hallway to hear every word. "I've been thinking about your situation." Katie's hand closed around the granola bar. "Still waiting? Have you considered veterinary work?" Mercer stepped closer, his posture relaxed, the posture of a man completely certain of his position in the hierarchy. "Your improvised methods might work better on animals, actually. They can't sue for malpractice. They can't file complaints. They just die quietly or get better. Much simpler than human medicine." He laughed. The sound bounced off the vending machine like a ricochet. One of the residents forced a chuckle. It sounded like breaking glass. A nurse pushing a medication cart looked away. Not at Katie. Away. The kind of looking away that said more than any words could have said, this was wrong, this was cruel, and she was sorry she had to witness it. Another nurse checked her phone. Suddenly very interested in her phone. Katie turned. Her hands were steady as she closed the granola bar package. Steady as the woman who had once held a tourniquet on an artery while a Black Hawk helicopter rotor wash tried to tear her sideways. Steady as the woman who had inserted a needle into another human being's chest cavity without flinching. "I'll consider all feedback, Dr. Mercer," she said. Not deferential. Not defiant. Just information delivered in the middle of a sentence and then discarded. She walked past him. Past the residents. Past the nursing staff who couldn't look at her. Back to her station where the charts were waiting and the patients were waiting and the work was always there because the work never cared about hierarchy. That afternoon, Mercer sat in his office with the door closed. His first call went to Richard Castellano, a board member with a wife who'd needed a boutique surgical consult that Mercer had personally recommended to his private practice. "Richard, I need your advice on a patient safety issue," Mercer said, his voice taking on the concerned tone of a doctor troubled by a difficult problem. "We have a nursing staff member who's been making independent medical decisions. Administering transfusions without attending oversight. The kind of thing that could expose the hospital to significant liability. I'm documenting it formally, but I wanted to flag it for the board before this escalates. The nurse's name is Katie Rodriguez. New hire. Seems competent on the surface, but there's a pattern of protocol violations that concerns me." He listened to Castellano's response. Heard the words patient safety. Heard the words liability. Heard the words I'll look into it. The second call went to Patricia Vance, another board member whose son had been treated in Mercer's trauma bay after a skiing accident, treatment that Mercer had given pro bono, a gesture Vance had appreciated, a gesture that created debt. Invisible. Powerful. "Patricia, I hate to bother you with this, but I'm in a difficult position." Mercer's voice became the voice of a reasonable man forced into difficult choices. "We have a situation with a nurse who's been making critical decisions outside her scope. Blood transfusions. Procedures. She nearly endangered a patient last night. I'm filing a formal complaint, but I think the board should be aware before this becomes a larger issue. Her name is Katie Rodriguez. She's on my service. I'm documenting everything, but I wanted to give you a heads up from one colleague to another." By morning, Katie's employee file contained a single sheet of white paper with the official hospital logo at the top. Written warning, protocol violation. The language was clinical. The accusation was precise. Unauthorized blood transfusion. Failure to obtain attending physician approval. Deviation from transfusion verification procedures. Patient safety concern. Below the written warning, a note that security would observe her next 3 shifts for additional infractions. A board contractor named Williams appeared at the beginning of Katie's shift. He took up position near the nursing station with his phone and his indifference and his instruction to watch her for anything that deviated from protocol. Katie's hands did not shake as she received the warning. Her jaw did not clench as she signed the acknowledgement. Her eyes did not betray anything as she returned to her rounds, her perfect posture, her steady movements, the way she moved through the hospital like a woman who had learned a long time ago that the only power available to people with no power was the power to endure. She checked vitals at 0800 hours. Medications at 0830. Charting at 0900. Everything by the book. Everything documented. Everything perfect. And that's when the phone in Marcus Chen's room began to slow. At 0247 hours, the monitor alarm erupted like a scream trapped in plastic and electronics. Katie's eyes were on the readout before her feet moved, oxygen saturation dropping in real time, the numbers falling like a stone, 94, 90, 85. The respiratory rate climbing, 20, 22, 26 breaths per minute. The neck veins distending, swelling, visible from the bedside like a hand pressing outward from beneath the skin. Tension pneumothorax. The security contractor Williams looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from boredom to the kind of concern a man has when he realizes he's about to witness something that will require paperwork. Katie moved to the bedside. Her eyes registered what her training had already diagnosed, the tracheal deviation, the absence of breath sounds on the right side, the chest wall asymmetry that said everything about what was happening in the space between the visceral and parietal pleura. She hit the code button. Dr. Patel arrived in 90 seconds, stethoscope swinging, his young face still slack with sleep. He was competent. He was careful. But he had never seen a field pneumothorax before, and field pneumothorax was a problem that required a different kind of thinking than rounds and protocols and careful deliberation could provide. Patel listened. His eyes widened. His hands began to shake as they lowered the stethoscope. I should call the attending. Marcus's lips were turning blue. The monitor showed oxygen at 72% and falling. Katie watched the color drain from Marcus's face, the same face she had saved 18 hours before, the same man whose blood type she had matched not by protocol but by the knowledge that he was going to die without it. She counted 3 seconds. Just 3. Then she turned to the crash cart. Dr. Patel, her voice level as ice water, he needs immediate needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Patel stared at her. Stared at the 14-gauge angiocath in her extended hand. Marcus's saturation hit 68%. The security observer stood. "You're not authorized to." Katie didn't look at him. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 100 field operations taking over, the movements identical to a Bagram airfield, to a convoy checkpoint, to a helicopter landing zone where the only hierarchy that mattered was the hierarchy of what kept people breathing. She prepped the site with the precision of a woman who had done this before, who had done this in the dark, who had done this while rounds came down around her like artillery. She looked at Dr. Patel one last time. Not a question. A statement, Doctor. He stepped back. Katie inserted the needle through skin and soft tissue and pleura, angling slightly caudal, her hand steady as a woman who had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury. The hiss of escaping air was immediate. The sound of pressure releasing, the sound of a lung expanding, the sound of survival happening in a single moment of decisive action. The monitor tone changed. Oxygen saturation climbed, 75, 82, 88. Marcus's color improved from blue to gray to something approaching human. His breathing slowed. His heart rate began to descend from the panic frequencies into something that resembled normal. Williams was already on his radio. "We have a protocol violation in ICU bed 7. Katie removed her hand from Marcus's chest. She disposed of the needle. She charted the time and the procedure and the vital signs response with her usual perfect penmanship. The room returned to normal heartbeats and mechanical ventilation and the fluorescent hum of a hospital doing what hospitals do. But something had changed. Katie had stayed undercover. Katie had saved a life. Katie had followed protocol violations and kept her face as blank as stone. And now Williams was watching her with the kind of attention that said he understood he had just witnessed something that didn't fit into normal categories of behavior. The monitor alarm shrieked at 02 for 7 hours. Not a warning beep. A full code blue scream, the kind that wakes the dead and sends every nerve ending on fire. Katie's head snapped up from the nurse's station where she'd been charting vitals under Williams's unblinking observation. The security contractor sat 3 feet away, legs crossed, reading incident reports on his phone with the casual attention of a man watching paint dry, but his eyes tracked her movements like a sniper on Overwatch. Bed 7. Marcus. The numbers on the monitor told the story in brutal detail, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone down a well. 94. 88. 72. His respiratory rate climbing fast, 32 breaths per minute, then 38, climbing still. The machine screaming what her eyes already saw. Marcus's neck veins distending, swollen like rope beneath his skin. His chest heaving against gravity itself, lungs desperately trying to inflate against something solid. Tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed again, but worse this time, air trapped between the lung and chest wall, pressing against his heart with every breath. If it compressed the vena cava, if it stopped the blood from returning to his heart, he had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. The on-call resident, a third-year named Dr. Patterson, pale as hospital walls and twice as useful right now, stood frozen in the doorway to Marcus's room. His mouth open. His hands hanging at his sides like broken marionette strings. Katie watched him for exactly 1 second, calculated the distance to the supply cart, the angle to the needle, the exact spot where a 14-gauge angiocath needed to find the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line. His crashing, Patterson whispered. Not an observation. A surrender. Katie moved. Not quickly, speed was sloppy, speed was panic. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this exact procedure in the dark while artillery hammered the earth around her. Muscle memory was a weapon sharper than any scalpel. Her hands reached for the emergency airway cart, found the needle, 14-gauge angiocath, 2¼ inches of salvation if she got it right, a death sentence if she didn't. William stood up from his chair. Katie could feel his movement like a change in air pressure, but she didn't look at him. She never looked away from Marcus, who was fighting now, his body in full respiratory distress, O2 sat falling, 68, now 63. The monitor's rhythm was already starting to flutter, the electrical pattern of a heart that knew something was wrong even if it didn't know what. Step back, Katie said to Patterson. Not a request. Not a suggestion. The voice that came out of her wasn't the deferential nurse who had nodded at Mercer's public dissection just 18 hours ago. This was the voice of someone who had held lives together in places where the ground was red and the sky was screaming. Patterson stepped back. He didn't argue. Nobody argues with that voice. Katie's gloved fingers found the landmarks by touch, the second rib, the space below it, the exact location where she'd learned this on a trauma surgeon's cadaver and perfected it on living human beings in conditions that made Seattle General's sterile fluorescent environment feel like a 5-star resort. She prepped the site with chlorhexidine in one smooth motion, the antiseptic's sharp chemical smell cutting through the recycled hospital air, and felt the needle slide against her fingers like an instrument she'd held 1,000 times before. Because she had. Just not in this uniform. The needle penetrated. Skin. Muscle. Fascia. Each layer offering its own resistance, its own feedback to hands that understood the language of emergency medicine better than they understood English. Marcus's eyes went wide, fear and pain mixing into something primal, but he wasn't screaming, wasn't thrashing. He was too far gone for that. He was just drowning in his own chest cavity while machines announced his descent. Then the hiss came. Air pressure releasing like a held breath finally breaking. The sound of carbon dioxide escaping through the needle in a thin, measured stream, the sound of a life being given back its chance. Katie could track the improvement by listening alone, but the monitor confirmed what her ears already knew. The oxygen saturation stopped its descent. Held at 55. Then began to climb. 58. 64. 72. 81. His respiratory rate dropping from the panic zone back toward something his body could sustain. The color returning to his face from gray-blue to something approximating human. His eyes focused, met hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second Katie saw the recognition there. He knew. He knew what she was. He knew what she'd just done, and more importantly, he knew why she could do it. "Get the attending," Katie said to Patterson, who was still standing in the doorway looking like someone had just rearranged the laws of physics in front of him. "Full chest tube. He needs a permanent solution." Patterson moved like he'd been electrocuted. Katie's hands were steady. That was the thing nobody ever talked about, the hands stayed steady. The heart could be hammering against the ribs like a caged bird, the mind could be running calculations that would make a chess computer dizzy, the adrenaline could be flooding every cell in the body with the chemical scream of fight or flight, but the hands stayed steady. She placed a sterile occlusive dressing over the needle site, securing it with tape that came off the roll like muscle memory in adhesive form. By the time the attending arrived, the real one, with 23 years of trauma experience and recognition in his eyes that said he understood exactly what he was looking at, Katie's vitals were baseline normal. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure 120/80. Breathing in the pattern of someone who had just saved a man's life and was now filling out paperwork. The attending surveyed the scene. Marcus's improving numbers. The needle. Katie standing beside the bed with her hands at her sides. Patterson in the corner looking like someone who'd watched a magician pull a full-grown human out of a hat. "Who did this?" the attending asked. "I did," Katie said. The attending looked at her for a long moment. That was a second intercostal decompression. Midclavicular line. 14-gauge angiocath. Perfect placement. He said it like he'd walked in to find the laws of physics had been momentarily suspended in front of him. Because in a way, they had. A nurse, just a nurse according to every official record, had just performed a procedure that required a medical license and a level of training that took years to accumulate. "You were trained." Katie didn't answer. She was watching Williams, who was watching her with an expression that had shifted from casual surveillance to something else entirely. Something that said he understood he had just witnessed something that didn't fit into normal categories of behavior. The attending moved to the bedside, beginning his own assessment, running through the checklist that would lead to a permanent chest tube and a transfer to the ICU. Within 15 minutes, Marcus had what he needed, his breathing stable, his numbers climbing toward the green zone. Within 30 minutes, the second incident report was being filed. Within 35 minutes, Dr. Mercer arrived. He wasn't in scrubs. He was in the BMW dealership polo shirt he'd been wearing at the vending machine, the one that probably cost more than Katie's monthly rent and meant absolutely nothing against the fact that his patient was alive because someone with actual training had stepped into the void. Mercer surveyed the scene, Marcus stable now, the attending documenting the emergency decompression, Katie standing against the far wall with her hands folded in front of her like someone waiting for a bus. His eyes locked on Williams. "You witnessed her perform a physician-level procedure." Mercer's voice was controlled. Almost pleased. Like a hunter who'd found the game trail leading exactly where he wanted. "Yes, sir. Emergency needle decompression. Textbook placement." Williams delivered it factually, but Katie could hear the slight hesitation. He'd seen what she'd done. More importantly, he'd seen how she'd done it. The muscle memory. The precision. The absolute absence of hesitation that marked someone who had done this more times than in a training scenario. Mercer pulled out his phone, made a note, and turned back to Katie. His smile was the smile of a man who'd just won something. "Captain Rodriguez, you are suspended effective immediately. Pending investigation. Badge and access card." The rank hung in the air between them for exactly 1 second. "Captain." He'd said it like it meant nothing, like it was just another word. But his eyes flickered. A micro-expression of confusion followed by something worse, something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Katie removed both items from her scrub pocket without argument. Her badge, laminated blue with her photograph. Her access card, worn from 6 weeks of constant use, carrying the magnetic strip that opened every door in Seattle General. She placed them in his extended hand with the same careful precision she'd used to place that needle. Performing procedures outside your scope demonstrates a dangerous pattern of overconfidence, Mercer continued, his voice returning to its normal register. Security will escort you out. 2 guards materialized from the hallway like they'd been waiting in the wings for this exact moment. Maybe they had. Maybe Mercer had called them the second he'd seen the incident report come across his phone. Katie turned and walked toward them, her stride measured, her face revealing nothing but the practiced composure of someone who had been trained to endure far worse than professional humiliation. As she passed Mercer, she heard him pull out his phone. Heard him begin to dial. Heard him speak a name, Dr. Richard Morrison, his mentor from medical school, and begin to construct a narrative that would chase her all the way out the door. Need you to verify credentials on a nurse named Katie Rodriguez. Dangerously overconfident. Possibly falsified credentials. Patient safety issue. The guards escorted her through the hallway. Past the nurse's station where people wouldn't meet her eyes. Past the supply room where she'd spent weeks photographing invoices that proved Mercer had been running a kickback scheme with medical suppliers, submitting duplicate billing codes, pocketing the difference in a pattern that stretched back 3 years and represented roughly $417,000. The evidence, all of it, was encrypted on a thumb drive she kept in her personal locker. The locker she'd just abandoned. Along with the folded flag from Luis Gonzalez, 25th Infantry Division, KIA Bagram, who'd been her medic before she became his. She kept it there as a good luck charm from a veteran friend, and she'd kept it there for 847 days, touching it before every shift, letting it ground her in why she was here pretending to be someone she wasn't. The rain started as soon as she hit the parking lot. Not Seattle rain, that was usually polite, almost apologetic about its existence. This was the kind of rain that came down like someone had turned a fire hose on the city, hammering the asphalt hard enough to make it steam. Katie walked toward the bus stop without hurrying, without looking back at the hospital where the evidence of a federal crime was sitting in a locker with a folded flag. By noon, the official email arrived on her personal phone. The nursing board would be opening an investigation into her employment history, her licensing credentials, and her clinical judgment. The email was polite. Professional. Devastating. It suggested strongly that she remain available for questioning and that she refrain from practicing nursing pending the outcome of their inquiry. The phone showed 6 missed calls from Seattle General HR. In her apartment on Pioneer Square, Katie sat in her damp scrubs and understood the precision of the trap. Mercer hadn't just suspended her. He'd called his medical school mentor to verify her credentials, which would reveal nothing because her nursing credentials were legitimate, but the inquiry itself would trigger flags in every system that connected to the state board. He'd called an investigator at the nursing board, someone who'd dismissed a malpractice case for Mercer 2 years ago and owed him a favor in the way that people owe favors when careers hang in the balance. By that evening, Katie would learn that Miranda Chen at the state nursing board had opened an investigation that would require her to submit documentation, explain her procedures, defend her competence to people who would be reviewing her file through the lens of a doctored narrative built by a man who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. And the thumb drive with 6 weeks of evidence was sitting in a hospital locker that security would have already processed by now. She pulled out her encrypted phone, the one that connected to a signal that bounced through 3 different continents before reaching a secure server in Falls Church, Virginia, and began typing the report that would reach her commanding officer by dawn. Undercover operation compromised. Cover blown. Evidence unrecovered. Requesting extraction protocols. Outside, the rain hammered down harder, and Katie understood that she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd revealed herself. She'd saved a life. She'd done what Captain Katie Rodriguez of the 75th Ranger Regiment had been trained to do in the moment it mattered most. She'd also just handed Dr. Mercer exactly what he needed to justify removing her from the hospital before she could finish the investigation. The game had just entered a new phase, and she had no idea what was about to walk through the doors that she'd just exited. Dr. Mercer arrived at 23 minutes past 3 in the morning, his face still creased with the imprint of his pillow, his collar buttoned wrong. He stood in the doorway of the intensive care unit and looked at Marcus Chen, stabilized, breathing. O2 sat climbing steadily to 96%, and then he looked at Katie. She was charting, her hand steady, her breathing even. She didn't look up. My office. Now. Not a request. A command with teeth. Katie set down her pen with the precision of someone disarming a device. She stood, followed him down the corridor where the fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of old bone. His office smelled like expensive cologne and desperation, that particular tang of a man realizing his control was slipping. He closed the door quietly. That was worse than shouting. You performed a procedure. His voice came out clipped, surgical. A needle decompression. On a patient. Outside your documented scope of practice as a registered nurse. Katie met his eyes. Said nothing. You are hereby suspended from all clinical duties, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Your badge is deactivated. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving fast. I'm also notifying the State Nursing Board of a serious credential discrepancy. They'll want to verify your qualifications. His thumbs flew across the screen, composing a message to Dr. Robert Chen at the University of Washington School of Medicine, * need to verify credentials on a nurse working Seattle General. Catherine Rodriguez. Appears dangerously overconfident, performing procedures well outside nursing scope. Potentially falsified qualifications. Urgent. *. Katie watched him type. Watched his jaw work as he hit send. Watched him lean back in his chair like a chess player who'd just moved his queen to checkmate. You're done here, he said quietly. By noon, the state will have opened a file on you. I have contacts. Very good contacts. Investigator named Patricia Hanover owes me a favor, a malpractice case I helped her dismiss last year. She'll be thorough. She'll be fair. He smiled. She'll also be looking for problems. Katie felt something crystallize in her chest. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. The understanding that he'd been planning this move since the vending machine, maybe since grand rounds. That he'd been moving pieces on a board she'd underestimated. That her suspension was just the opening move in something larger. You can leave on your own or with security. Choose quickly. He waved a hand dismissively and turned to his computer. Already moving to the next item. Already writing the next damaging email. She was yesterday's problem. By 9:30 that morning, investigator Patricia Hanover from the State Nursing Board, a woman with the face of someone who'd learned to smile while holding a knife, was reviewing Katie's file in a conference room at Seattle General. The file, mysteriously, contained 3 anonymous complaints about Katie's reckless overconfidence and procedures outside scope. The complaints were recent. All 3 dated within the last 24 hours. All 3 from different IP addresses. All 3 pointing to the same conclusion: Catherine Rodriguez was a danger to patients. Hanover didn't know that 2 of those IP addresses belonged to computers in Dr. Mercer's home. She also didn't know that Mercer had spent 40 minutes last night crafting language that sounded concerned, worried, almost reluctant, the tone of a physician forced to report a colleague. She just knew her benefactor had called personally and asked her to be thorough. So she was thorough. She dug. She documented. She prepared a recommendation for immediate license review. By 11:47, Katie was standing in the ground floor lobby of Seattle General wearing her street clothes, her hospital ID badge in a plastic bag in the security officer's hand. The bag also contained her stethoscope, her trauma shears, her handful of pens. Her life, reduced to inventory. The security officer, a kind man named Marcus who'd worked the night shift and seen nothing of the decisions being made above him, walked her to the employee exit. I'm sorry, he said quietly. This seems wrong. Katie thanked him. Didn't explain. Didn't defend herself. Just walked out into the San Antonio heat and got on a bus. Her apartment was silent when she arrived. Emma was still at school, Mrs. Castellano picking her up at 3:30 like always. Katie had 45 minutes before her daughter came home. She used it to sit at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, staring at the mission report form still open on her laptop screen. The cursor blinked in the field labeled * status of investigation. * She typed, operation terminated prematurely. Cover compromised. Evidence insufficient for federal indictment. Subject remains active. Recommend enhanced surveillance. She deleted it. Typed again, failed. Deleted that too. At 3:47, Emma burst through the front door with the kind of chaos only a 7-year-old could generate, butterfly pins clipped to her backpack, a smudged sticker on her cheek from the library, her shoes already half off. She stopped when she saw her mother at the kitchen table. Katie's eyes were red. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were red, and Emma, who was only 7 but had learned to read her mother's body language the way other children read picture books, knew something was very wrong. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Katie reached for her daughter and pulled her close, pressing her face into the wild tangle of her hair, and the tears came, silent ones, the kind that didn't announce themselves but just fell like rain, soaking into Emma's shirt. Emma stood very still, the way children do when they sense an adult's breaking point. She didn't ask questions. She just let her mother hold her. Katie thought about Marcus Chen in that hospital bed. Marcus, who should have been running medevac operations in Helmand province but was instead stuck here, in a civilian hospital, nearly dying twice because she'd been pulled from the field to hunt a corruption case that she'd just spectacularly failed to close. She thought about Mercer in his pressed suit, already 3 moves ahead of her, already calling his contacts, already rewinding the tape of her competence until everyone would believe she'd never had any to begin with. She thought about Lewis. The folded flag, service dress blue, funeral creased, small enough to fit in her locker, that she'd carried as a good luck charm from a veteran friend, which was the only way she could explain it to civilian co-workers. Lewis had died believing his team would stop corruption wherever they found it. And she'd left his flag behind on a shelf above her spare scrubs like it was laundry. Her phone buzzed at 5:12 p.m. Colonel James Price, * hospital convened emergency hearing. Chen family threatening legal action. Hearing is 0900 tomorrow. Attend a civilian. *. Katie read it 3 times. Looked at Emma, who'd fallen asleep on her shoulder, small and trusting and completely unaware that her mother had just destroyed an 18-month federal investigation. She should skip the hearing. Let it go. Make a clean break and find a way to rebuild her cover, restart the operation, approach Mercer from a different angle. Instead, at 11:43 p.m., she replied, "I'll be there. **. And across the city, in a hospital bed with a chest tube running underneath his gown, Marcus Chen lay awake and staring at the ceiling, his lung fully expanded now, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 98%. He pressed the call button for the night nurse and asked one question, "The one who saved me? Rodriguez. Is she here?" When the nurse told him Katie had been suspended, Marcus closed his eyes and made a single phone call. A Marine contact from his last deployment. A man who answered on the second ring at midnight and listened to 14 seconds of explanation before saying, "Send me the hospital details." The room went quiet except for the soft hiss of his oxygen and the distant sound of monitors keeping time like a heartbeat made visible. The next morning arrived like a verdict. The hospital conference room on the 4th floor filled with administration before 8 o'clock, Board Chair Douglas Kim, Attorney Solis, 3 board members in charcoal suits, all arranged around a polished oak table that reflected the fluorescent lights like a mirror made of ice. Hospital security had been called off Katie's shift. The written warning had been upgraded to immediate suspension pending investigation. But Marcus Chen's family had hired a medical malpractice attorney who specialized in wrongful suspension cases, and that attorney had filed a federal complaint alleging retaliation against a veteran for speaking out about patient safety, and that complaint had triggered protocols that even Dr. Mercer's board allies couldn't quietly bury. At 7:19 a.m., Marcus rolled into the hallway outside that conference room in a wheelchair, his left leg still bandaged but his eyes clear, his shoulders squared. Katie was delivering a chart to the nurses' station 40 feet away when she felt him there. She turned. Their eyes locked across the corridor, the kind of eye contact that carries language, that speaks in frequencies only certain people understand. Marcus wheeled closer, slow and deliberate, and when he reached her he stopped exactly 2 feet away. He didn't speak. He simply locked his gaze on hers and whispered one word. Valkyrie. The call sign hung in the air like something physical. Not her real name. The name she'd carried for 18 months at Bagram, the name spoken only by men who'd bled in the same room she'd worked in, men who understood what it meant to move through impossible moments with hands steady enough to save lives. Katie's jaw tightened just slightly, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't trained to read the smallest shifts in another person's composure. She nodded. Once. Then she turned and walked back toward the pharmacy, her hands perfectly steady, her stride unchanged, but something in the hospital's frequency had shifted. Someone in this building now knew. Not suspected. Knew. 30 seconds later, Marcus wheeled himself into the conference room. Attorney Solis was mid-sentence when he entered. Board Chair Kim paused. Staff Sergeant Chen, we appreciate your appearance despite. Captain Katie Rodriguez, Marcus interrupted, his voice clear and steady. Bronze Star with Valor. Bagram Airfield. For rendering life-saving aid under direct enemy fire while coordinating medevac for 12 wounded. He continued as if reading from a document he had memorized years ago, each phrase deliberate and precise. Purple Heart. Second deployment. Another Purple Heart. Third deployment, intelligence liaison attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, call sign Dark Horse. Expert field trauma protocol. Certified combat medic instructor. His voice grew stronger with each sentence, louder, not angry but authoritative, the kind of voice that filled rooms. The same person you suspended yesterday for saving my life twice in 72 hours using textbook emergency medicine procedures. Dr. Mercer stood abruptly. This is theater. This is completely irrelevant to the scope of. Sit down, Dr. Mercer, Attorney Solis said quietly. Board member Patricia Vance slid her chair backward, creating physical distance, her face flushing. She had accepted a phone call from Mercer 2 days ago. He had asked her to support his suspension recommendation. She had agreed. The conference room door opened at 8:14 a.m. Marine Colonel James Price walked in wearing dress blues, the uniform so sharp it looked like it could cut. A service record folder 3 inches thick sat in his hands. He saluted Katie, who was standing in the doorway, her expression unchanged. Colonel Price set the folder on the conference table. For the record, he said, Captain Rodriguez has been conducting a federal investigation into Medicare fraud under Pentagon direction for the past 4 months. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then at 8:44 a.m., a 2-star general walked through the door. Not as an observer. As the presence that made the air pressure change, that commanded rooms simply by existing in them. Her name was Major General Susan Hayes, and she wore her uniform like a second skin, her medals spanning her chest in ordered ranks. She looked at the decorations that Mercer had mocked at the hospital's summer barbecue, the ones he'd called participation trophies when he saw Katie's apartment photos during the event, and she saluted them. The general saluted the nurse. The board members watched a 2-star general salute the woman they'd voted to suspend 24 hours earlier. Captain Rodriguez has served under my command, General Hayes said. Her voice carried the weight of authority spoken so many times it had become its own language. The investigation she's conducted has identified approximately $2.3 million in fraudulent medical supply billing involving this hospital's procurement department. Attorney Solis opened the classified briefing document. Her voice was measured and precise as she read aloud, kickback arrangements with FarmCorp Solutions. Systematic Medicare upcoding across 17 months. Falsified invoices. Duplicate billing codes. Timestamped photographic evidence of unauthorized access to supply room inventory records during OFAUs for the purpose of altering documentation. She paused. Dr. Mercer's personal financial accounts received 12 deposits from FarmCorp Solutions totaling approximately $420,000. Dr. Mercer's attorney stood, but Mercer himself remained frozen. His usual confidence, the thing that had powered him through the last 4 months of harassment and weaponization, simply evaporated. It was like watching the air leave a balloon. Colonel Price placed a thumb drive on the table. These contain photographs Captain Rodriguez took of all relevant shipping invoices. Duplicated billing codes. Timestamped access logs showing Dr. Mercer's badge entry into the supply room at hours when the department was closed. Federal investigators will be collecting Dr. Mercer's work computer and files within the hour. Outside, in the hallway, a nursing student named Jennifer Park stood with her phone raised. She'd been curious about the activity, the uniforms, the general. She'd started recording when the conference room door opened, and her phone had captured everything. The Marine Colonel. The 2-star general. The salute to the quiet nurse who'd been humiliated at the vending machine 3 days earlier. She stopped recording and stared at what she'd just captured. Then she posted it. The video spread like something alive. 1,500 views in an hour. 30,000 by noon. The caption read, "That nurse Dr. Mercer called stupid is actually a decorated Army captain." The video reached Dr. Sarah Chen, Dean of Stanford Medical School, by 1:17 p.m. She'd been Mercer's dissertation advisor. His mentor. The physician who'd written his letter of recommendation. She watched the vending machine footage 3 times, watched him suggest that this woman should work at a veterinary clinic, watched him destroy her credibility in front of witnesses, and then she watched the general salute. Dr. Chen's jaw set like concrete. She released a public statement at 2:43 p.m. Dr. Mercer's behavior represents everything our institution opposes. I personally fail to see the character flaws evident in his conduct. I am formally disowning any professional association and calling for his immediate termination from all medical boards. The statement went live. The medical board received her formal complaint by 4:56 p.m. Hospital PR fielded 43 press calls. By 5:11 p.m., Mercer's attorney arrived to find him already being escorted from the building, his badge deactivated, federal investigators in FBI windbreakers photographing his office and cataloging evidence from his filing cabinet. But that wasn't the moment. The real moment came 6 months later. Katie walked through the parking lot of San Antonio VA Hospital in her Army dress uniform, the morning sun catching her captain's bars and the ribbon rack across her chest. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. 7 others in precise alignment. The concrete beneath her boots was still wet from overnight rain, smelling of diesel fuel and mesquite. Her stride was unchanged from the day she'd arrived at Seattle General, purposeful, controlled, nothing wasted. A white medical supply van sat in the 3rd row, FarmCorp Solutions logos half scraped off the side. Inside the driver's seat, Dr. Mercer sat checking a delivery manifest, wearing a gray uniform shirt with his name patch stitched in. His eyes lifted as Katie passed. Their gazes met for exactly 2 seconds. His face went blank and he looked straight ahead, pretending not to recognize her, his hands white-knuckling the steering wheel as she continued toward the hospital entrance. A banner hung above the doors, Combat Medicine Lecture Series. Today, Captain Katie Rodriguez. In the audiology room, 47 residents filled every seat, standing room only in the back. Katie clicked to her first slide, a field photo from Bagram, showing a convoy staging area, mortar rounds impacting 100 yards distant, and began. Most of you will never work in a combat zone, but every single emergency room has the same fundamental truth. Hesitation kills. The residents leaned forward, pens ready. She walked them through needle decompression, through blood products triage, through the decision-making architecture that separates acceptable risk from acceptable loss. She spoke without notes. She spoke like someone who'd lived every single word. 90 minutes evaporated like water on hot asphalt. When she finished, the applause came like relief. A young resident named Martinez approached afterward. "Captain Rodriguez, I watched you save that ranger's life. The video is why I chose emergency medicine." Katie shook his hand, her grip firm enough that he felt the calluses. "Then you're in the right specialty." Outside, Marcus waited in civilian clothes, walking with only a slight limp, holding Emma's hand. Katie's daughter was chattering about her science fair project. Marcus grinned when Katie emerged. "Still stealing my thunder, Valkyrie?" Katie smiled, the first genuine one in 6 months, and ruffled Emma's hair. They walked toward the parking lot together as the morning sun climbed higher, catching the edges of things, making everything visible. Behind them, Katie's voice carries into the fade, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you know someone whose strength runs deeper than anyone suspects, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the heroes nobody sees coming. Like this video and let me know in the comments, have you ever judged someone completely wrong? Your stories matter.